Every year, around about the end of May, early June, our Florida Bahamas Senate, of which we are a part, has our annual Senate Assembly where congregations send people and church leaders to come and gather in our assembly. And one of the things that they do each year is recognize ordination anniversaries for our pastors and deacons. And they usually start off at about like 15 and then just ask people to kind of wave, and then they work their way up into 25, 30, 35. Sooner or later, they get up to like 50, 60 years of ordination. And sometimes those people aren't there to be recognized. They're retired. They're maybe off doing other things. Maybe their mobility is not great and they can't be there. But one year, one of my kids was there as our youth voting member, and they got to the ordination anniversaries, and they got up to 70 years because we had one of our local pastors that had hit that 70th year since his ordination. And he was there. He was sitting right down the row from us. He stood up. He waved. The whole audience had a big applause. And then they moved to the next agenda item, which was to celebrate congregational anniversaries. And they started off at like 25, and then they kept going. And there was maybe one past 70, at which point my son elbowed me and said, "He's been ordained longer than any of these churches have been around." And I said, "Yeah, actually, that's a good point. He was ordained in the late 1940s, and what was in Florida in the late 1940s? Not near as much as here now, right?" And because what it tells you is that we live in a relatively young place. I am older than my house. I am older than the high schools my kids went to. Many of you are older than a lot of what we have around us. Even the things that are sort of old, like we're getting ready to replace the whole interchange here at Sand Lake and Turkey Lake or whatever, that's probably not that old. We've just decided it needs to be new again. And so we live in a place where stuff is always new and seems new and relatively young. Today we hear a passage from Paul where it's kind of hard to hear because he starts off and it's in the midst of a longer thing. He says, listen, if you're married, act as if you're not. If you're grieving, live as if you're not. If you are rejoicing, live as if you're not. If you're buying things, act like you're not. If you are engaged in the world, just might as well live as if you're not, because the present world is passing away. And when you hear that, just on its surface, it sounds like Paul is saying, just disengage with everything. Your relationships, your emotions, if that's even possible, your stuff, the world around you. Now, I just spent 2 weeks traveling through Paul's footsteps in Greece and Rome, in not new places, but ancient places. One of the places we went, Paul probably wasn't there, but it's called Meteora, and there's these monasteries that are built on top of these huge rock formations. But before there were monasteries, our guide told us that monks, hermit monks, would just go live in the holes in the side of the rock, like up in the cliffs, all by themselves. And if you think about that, they're kind of doing what Paul said to do, right? Forget about marriage, forget about yourself, forget about stuff, forget about the world. Just go live in a hole in a rock. Now, is that really practical for everyone? Probably not, right? So they end up building monasteries on top of these things and monastic communities in a way, right? Not married, they're withdrawn from society a little bit. But again, if Paul really means for everyone to just withdraw from everything, how's that going to work? We tried it a little bit during the pandemic, right? Kids stayed home, people worked from home, we did church from home. How did that work? Not very well, right? And so I don't think Paul is really encouraging us to completely disconnect from the world around us, from our relationships, our emotions, all the rest of it. So he must mean something else. And I think what he means is probably tied to the last little bit we heard, which is that the present world is passing away. Now again, that's hard to see sometimes when we live where everything is relatively new. But when you go to a very, very old part of the world, it's a different experience. The first place we visited was Philippi. It was once a thriving city right next to the Roman Ignatian Road. Now when you stand in Philippi, you get to see what the archaeologists have dug up. And it's mostly like the outlines of little buildings that would have been shops or homes. There's the outline of the Roman marketplace. They've restood up some columns that fell. There's a part where there later was a church that was built, and you can kind of look and go, yeah, This must have been magnificent at some point. But then an earthquake came in the 7th century, and Philippi began a great decline, and now it's just ruins. So when Paul says the present world is passing away, right? If you go to a place like Philippi, you see, yeah, stuff doesn't last forever, even if it's made out of huge blocks of marble that were meant to stand for a really long time. Same thing was true in Corinth. We went to Rome. When you're walking around Rome, there'll be like a bank, and then there'll be like a shop, and then there'll just be a hole in the ground with a big column laying there that some archaeologists started digging up, and it's right there. Amidst these not new buildings in terms of our age of community, but newer buildings, there's ruins. And those ruins are a reminder that the present age is passing away. But it's not just the old stuff. Greece's economy has not been the most thriving of economies in the last 30 years. And so when we drove around Greece, you would see empty shops. You would see a window, a sign above the window, but through the window you could just see like emptiness, dirt, and like a ductwork that's hanging down. And you've seen stuff like that around, right? And we saw a lot of that. And we saw buildings that looked like they never got built all the way, and buildings that weren't that old with the roof caved in. And I started to think of those as modern day ruins, right? We saw ancient ruins, but then there were modern day ruins of things that aren't that old, but that still are passing away as the present age passes away. But I also figured out that it wasn't just about buildings. We visited a church in Athens that's one of the oldest churches in Greece. But before it was a church, it was part of a big row of buildings that led down to the sea for an emperor. And then when Christianity became the religion of the empire, it became a church. But then the Ottomans took over and turned it into a mosque and built a tower outside for the call to prayer. But then the Ottomans lost power, and then the Greeks are back. And so over the door of the church is a sign in Arabic that was put in when it was a mosque. And over the top of that sign is a little image of St. George, which is what the church is called now. And standing there and looking at that, you realize that not just buildings, but empires fall into ruin, right? The power structures and the people and the processes and all that went with the culture. In Paul's day, everybody in the community spoke Greek. That was the language of commerce. Is that the language of commerce today? What is it? English, right? And so you see that like empires fall into ruins, not just buildings. Then you start to think about Paul saying that the present age has passed away. You can just start to think about what we experience in our day today. Have any of you ever had a friendship fall into ruins? Sometimes it's because of something, conflict, right? I think of like the earthquake that leveled Philippi, right? Sometimes we have an earthquake in a relationship because we did something or they did something, and then it just is something that becomes irreconcilable and it ends up in ruins. Other times, though, you just move or lose touch over time, and that friendship just becomes a shell of what it once was and part of those ruins of the past. Certainly, we've all seen marriages that end in ruins. But even the best marriages, right, the ones that last for 70 years, end because someone dies, right? The present age is always passing away. Anybody ever have a job end in ruins? Right? And sometimes that's our own fault, and sometimes it's the environment, right? All of this is to say that nothing lasts forever, and the present age is always passing away. And Paul talks about your grief and your rejoicing. We have grudges, we have guilt, we have shame that we carry along with us, all of it sort of marking ruins of our journey along the way. So when Paul is saying to us, act as if you're not married, act as if you're not grieving or rejoicing or buying things or engaging with the world, what I think he's really saying is that we can get really wrapped up in any one relationship or any one possession or any one thing and lose track that the world is happening around us all the time. It's constantly changing and shifting and passing away. I don't think he's encouraging us to disengage from the world, but to engage with the world and just to not cling too tightly, right? When I think about the buildings that were there when Paul was there, buildings are expensive to maintain, right? And so when you think about maintaining, sooner or later, stuff does fall into ruins because the effort to take, right? So Paul is saying we can spend all our time trying to maintain what is and lose track of the shifting and changing blessings that might be right in front of us because things are always passing away. And we actually saw this. When we were in Philippi, our guide told us how many people lived in that city at that time. And so we're looking at what got excavated, and we're like, that many people lived right there? And she said, oh, no, 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 no. It stretched all the way out to the road. Well, if you looked out to the road, it was farmland. So where there used to be a city, they're now growing food. And she said to excavate the rest of that, they're going to have to buy the land from the farmers who are growing food over the top of what used to be a thriving city. Then we're in Rome, and we're walking along, and there was these interesting places where you'd stand here, and there'd be like 12 or more, 2 staircases down, and this big temple facade is down there, and the guide would say, when that was built, that was street level. And now here we are, like a whole another bunch of feet up higher, which means there is civilization underneath you. So he would look at us and say, that church was built in the 16th century. Underneath it is a church that was built in the 5th century. Underneath that is a Roman temple. And underneath that, like just layers of things. Now, on the one hand, that's a sign that the present age is always passing away. But on the other hand, it's a sign that there's always something new. Some of those churches that were built on top of the ruins, on top of the ruins, on top of the ruins were just ornate, beautiful places that you just walk in and they took your breath away at how big and spacious and beautiful the things were inside of them, all on top of ruins. Paul, as he always is, points to Jesus regularly, right? That he, when he talks about his own journey, talks about all of the things of his past and says they're all rubbish, right? Ruins. But it's Jesus that has claimed him, right? And he talks about the resurrected Jesus, and that's God taking the ruins of death and making new life. What I think Paul is encouraging us to do is to love deeply, to engage deeply in the world around us, to fully, right, jump into life in the present time, always knowing that it's fragile and tender and passing away. But even as that is happening, God is always doing something new. The hard part is when you're in the midst of the ruins, to trust that that new thing is coming. And that's where our faith comes in, that God will always build that new thing for us. We just might not see it until we look back and see where God has been doing that new thing all along. Amen.